importantly, within ourselves. Fortunately, that change is happening.
Nonviolence to me is the source of power. And the power is actually in each person. One thing we have in common as individuals, as human beings, is the power to show love. The basis of nonviolence is love. And first of all, in order to have love, you have to have a heart. And each person has a heart. My point is, when you step out of the shower, you're fully armed.
It seems like every one of us has this big library of humanity and nonviolence inside him. To be able to meet the human being inside you and to discuss with him about yourself. Nonviolence is to be an artist of your humanity, to bring the best of you. Not just by solving problems, but also by living, by experiencing, by practicing. It's about your humanity is my weapon. And I have to be able to bring you to that place.
To me, one of the core principles of nonviolence, this core worldview of nonviolence, is this unwavering faith in humanity and in the goodness of people. No matter how much harm someone may have committed, that the possibility of transformation and the possibility of resilience is always there.
My brother was very violently murdered by Israeli soldiers. 1 year after, my mother receiving a phone call from a very religious Jewish Israeli father that his son was kidnapped and killed by Hamas, telling us that there is a group of parents, Israeli parents, who have lost someone of their family members, and they are willing to come and pay condolences. I was born in 72, and that meeting happened in 2001. That was the first time in my life that I saw an Israeli crying. And then my mother was crying with the same color of tears with a Jewish mother in my home. That touched me deep. Because I told myself, if these people who paid the highest price can stand for my right and can understand what does it mean to lose someone, so everyone can. I realized that justice is this step when we decide to give up being the victim of the victimizers and not to be in this prison of hatred and victimhood.
The work of forgiveness, the work of letting go, the work of healing through our own traumas, I think is so important in nonviolence. I think oftentimes, even when we think of nonviolent movements, we think of how do we fix those people out there? And there's a time and a place for that, absolutely. There's a lot of things out there that do need to be changed. And at the same time, I think a lot of the work of nonviolence is about owning the ways in which we contribute to harm and the ways in which we contribute to systems of violence.
We didn't respect you. We polluted your earth. We've hurt you in so many ways. And we've come to say that we are sorry. We are at your service, and we beg for your forgiveness.
We lose sight of the fact that we ourselves are beings that want to be in good relationships with each other, and sometimes it's easy for us to be hateful and to be angry at everyone, but it's always possible to reach the core of who we are.
I just recognize that there's no one that I can't learn something from. As we try to make a difference, it's important that in our certainty, we don't eliminate those who disagree with us. And I love nonviolence because it is a way that you can show up boldly and passionately and try new things. Nonviolence makes me look for a solution that is win-win, a solution that's not zero-sum, a solution that recognizes, too, if we don't figure out how to share this planet with people of different or similar truth claims, that we could also have a lose-lose.
We are continually inviting people to really work with the two hands of nonviolence. That Barbara Deming, the late feminist writer, talked about, an activist. The two hands of nonviolence being, on the one hand, I will not cooperate with your injustice, but I'm open to you as a human being. I think this is the job description of the 21st century.
Nonviolence has been with us as long as we've been human. It's a legacy we can all claim, and if we do, we can repair and transform the world. So why don't we hear more about it?
There had been no systematic studies on the comparative effectiveness of nonviolent and violent struggle. There had been plenty of studies comparing the effectiveness of different types of violent struggle, but nobody had ever studied the empirical comparison between nonviolent and violent methods of struggle by civilian actors. Very few people actually look at the full range of strategic options, including nonviolent ones, and compare them against the violent ones. And this is something that my whole life's work now is seeking to remedy.
It all started really with the Tiananmen Square episode when those students were massacred. It hurt me very much. My colleagues and I in the nonviolence field, we'd noticed that they were making certain tactical errors that could easily have been adjusted, but in those days there was no internet. We couldn't just ring them up. So we thought, well, I hope it'll work out for the best. And it worked out for the worst. We're trying to help people practice nonviolence more safely and more effectively. So behind that, we're also trying to build a nonviolent culture in which the general public, not necessarily activists, will understand what nonviolence is and know that they have a big array of resources embedded in that power, which we could deploy to basically build a better world.
In South Sudan, we have teams around the country who are working on what are called protection of civilian sites. Two of our colleagues happened to be right where this was starting. They had gone in that day to organize. They were going to do some work with a group of women, and when this all started.
A large crowd of people banging against the perimeter gate. You could hear stones coming over after a couple of minutes, and then ultimately gunshots.
We were trying to encourage people to move with us. It became unsafe to keep going. If you keep running, you're gonna get shot in the back. There were around 9 children and 4 women who were also just looking around, like didn't really know what to do. So we just encouraged them to go in a tent with us. Like you could hear the gunshots, you could smell the gunpowder, you could hear the casings falling on the ground. There were at least 3 to 4 attempts of just trying to get us out. People with weapons coming in, saying like, you guys go. And we said like, we're not leaving. After a long time, the women, they perceived it as safe. They immediately came out, so we came out with them.
They were able to present this particular approach and hold on to it, and at one point really have like a few minute conversation with somebody explaining their position, that's what it was that created that space. And so in the end of what was a very terrible day, at least these 14 women and children were safe.
If we had a gun in those instances, we were like an armed peacekeeper, we probably would have been killed.
You can be assertive without being aggressive. Being confronted by people with sticks, axes, pistols, automatic rifles. We have different tools. We have different weapons, if you will. Non-violence is a powerful thing. It's underappreciated and underestimated, but it can have a transformative effect, It can change the stakes.
When we talk about unarmed civilian protection, the use of unarmed strategies and tools implemented by civilians to increase security and to decrease violence, it is a pragmatic, practical approach to the realities of violence that is having direct impact. It's saving lives. This is not us being, peace activists who are very idealistic and we hope unicorns and rainbows will rule the world one day. This is hard work. There's nothing easy about it, but it works.
The way that one fights a struggle really does help to determine the way the country will look in the aftermath. Nonviolent campaigns are about 10 times likelier to usher in democratic institutions within 5 years after the end of the conflict compared with violent insurgencies. They're also 4 times more likely to usher in these institutions even when they fail. So nonviolent campaigns are creating a type of oppositional activity or political space that couldn't have occurred in their absence. From 1900 to 2006, campaigns that relied on mass nonviolent struggle were twice as effective as the violent ones. They were also becoming more effective over time. So since about the 1960s, nonviolent resistance has become a much more powerful force for change than violent resistance, and it's also becoming far more frequent. One of the big myths that's busted through our data is that nonviolent resistance takes longer to achieve results than violent insurgency. In fact, what we find is strikingly the opposite, that nonviolent campaigns, fully mobilized, typically take about 3 years to run their course, whereas violent insurgencies take about 9 to 10 years. From 2010 to 2014, we see more new onsets of mass nonviolent action around the world than we saw in the entire decade of the 1990s. nonviolent resistance is more powerful and effective and becoming the choice du jour, so to speak, whereas violent resistance is going out of style in a major way.
I do dimly perceive that whilst everything around me is ever changing, ever dying, there is underlying all that change a living power that is changeless, that holds all together, that creates, dissolves, and recreates.
Nonviolence is as old as the hills. That's a direct quote from Gandhi. What Gandhi did that was different was to give it a local habitation and a name. So he had this contest in 1908, and they came up with the word satyagraha, which means clinging to truth. But in ancient India, there had been a term called ahimsa, which means the absence of an intention to harm. Or it really means the creative power that's generated when you have controlled any intention to harm. Now, that term, translated literally into English, which happened sometime in the late 1920s, became nonviolent. So that shows you, we've had a word for violence since Latin language, but we haven't had a word for nonviolence before 1920. So that shows you how far behind the curve we have been, and it also shows you why we overlook the thing, even when it's right in front of our noses.
What kind of self-concept as a species do we have? We humans, we think of ourselves traditionally, at least in Western society, as driven by selfishness and competition, and we aggressively pursue these goals. And that needs to be reflected in our society. Our society should reflect these competitive tendencies. That's sort of the capitalist system. That's how it operates. And sort of unbridled competition is a good thing for society. And it's sort of interesting how in 2008, when that whole system collapsed financially, and we saw that unbridled competition is not going to fix the job that we wanted to do, how people started to think differently. That gave us an opening to start talking about empathy and cooperation in a different way.
Protests are spreading from cyberspace to streets all around the country. 50 cities now, from Salt Lake City to Topeka to Knoxville.
We've been telling ourselves the same old story, at least since the Industrial Revolution, that we're all separate physical beings whose needs are in competition. But based on scientific breakthroughs that started a century ago and whose significance is now catching on, scientists, academics, and activists are calling this the old story and giving us an entirely different and more realistic vision for the future.
Cooperation is actually very widespread in the animal kingdom. There's actually very few animals who survive without some form of cooperation. This whole notion that deep down we are bad and we need to work very hard to be good, that's an idea that's sort of out of the window now.
The new story is building on that. It's saying we're not inherently separate. As this scientific research continues to expand, in the areas of quantum physics and so on. They're learning more and more, the science community, about how interconnected all of the life is. In 1986, a group of scientists from around the world convened and they issued the Seville Statement. They said, there's nothing in our DNA that says that we're predisposed to violence. It's also scientifically incorrect to say that we're separate. That's just not true. And the more you can realize how connected life is, it makes it even more important to engage in these nonviolent practices. And it also helps you understand why it's so effective. There is something that connects all of us. So when we're helping other people, we are helping ourselves.
Cooperation is just as much a part of us as competition. And every disaster proves that. Often in evolution, the cooperative mode was driven by disasters.
In our trainings, we get the question a lot that, well, isn't violence just part of human nature? And I used to struggle with that question until I heard a guy named Paul Chappell speak. Paul Chappell is a graduate of the military academy at West Point and is now a peace activist. And he once told me that every study that has ever been conducted on violence shows that violence is traumatic. Even if you're not a direct participant in it, just witnessing violence can cause PTSD, trauma, depression, anxiety, all these permanent disorders. And yet, not a single person has ever been traumatized by an act of love or an act of compassion. He says that to him, that is evidence that violence is not part of our human nature. The things that fulfill us as human beings, that bring us closer to our potential, love and understanding and community, that those things are our truest nature as human beings.
If you start from the assumption that everybody has a good core in their nature, that we're all deeply interconnected, that there is no problem which cannot be resolved to the benefit of all parties. If you start with those assumptions, and even if you don't believe them, you take them on as a hypothesis, as assumptions, and you test them, and you find out that it works.
Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory has designed 50% of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, and some of us troop out there on occasion and engage in nonviolent action. One time, a group of us went out and we said we were going to lay in the street in front of the South Gate and not get up when they order us to, as a symbol of our non-cooperation. After a while, a police officer comes over and says, okay, now I want you to get up. You're under arrest. And I actually told him, I'm sorry, I can't do that today. So he grabs my arm and is kind of trying to tug me and pull me up. His commanding officer across the street says, don't fool around with that guy. Just break his wrist. And so just automatically he starts to break my wrist. And something came to me at that point. In addition to the pain I was feeling in my wrist, I just kind of leaned up a little bit. Didn't get up, but I leaned up and I said, you don't have to do that. You don't have to break my wrist. And the guy was now suddenly very confused, and he continued to try to twist then he let go. So this guy has given my wrist back to me. So I feel like I want to give him something. So I get up and I walk with him. And we're walking along to the police van. And he turns to me and he says, thank you so much for telling me I didn't have to break your wrist. I didn't want to break your wrist. but I got an order and that's what I do. But you broke the spell. And I said, well, I said, great. And we ended up having a wonderful half-hour conversation about our lives. Those kinds of moments have shown me what's possible.
What we have been calling the nonviolent moment or the nonviolent effect actually has a physiological component, a physiological pathway. So let's say that you are threatening me and I do the nonviolent conversion in my mind or my heart or wherever that goes on. And I act towards you with respect on the one hand, but with refusal to comply with your unjust command on the other hand. I am now in a very different mental state from what you expected. My mental state is actually being mapped in your brain.
You have in your own brain some cells that control your own muscles, but that also, when you're just watching the actions of others, fire up, as if by watching the actions of other people, you are seeing your own actions reflected by a mirror. What you need to do is to suppress your immediate tendency to react and to be aggressive yourself. But if you're able to suppress that and to have a calm demeanor, then inevitably you're going to have to induce in the other person some form of mirroring of your calm demeanor, which will probably dampen the aggression level of that individual. I believe that in the Western world, we get a lot of things wrong. We are so focused on the individual. There's this idea of the self that is detached. Whereas in Eastern philosophies, there's this notion of connectedness. And I think that what mirror neurons do when we do interact like this, I'm no longer Marco, you're no longer Dalai Lama, we are us in this interaction. I think that's an important concept to remember, to propagate. And this could actually increase our potential for empathy.
Wonderful. Now, I usually sort of believe basic human nature is gentleness, compassionate. So it seems now you are supporting that.
Oh, yeah.
There are disciplines that a person can practice daily that help you deal with the strong emotions that are going to come up in a serious conflict. When you're dealing with your own fear and your own anger, it's really pretty easy to deal with somebody else's fear and anger that they're throwing at you.
We come out of the tradition of Dr. Bernard Lafayette and the leaders of the Nashville Lunch Counter Sit-ins, who trained under the Reverend James Lawson for months and months and months before they took their first step. We also come from the tradition of Gandhi, who, with his 78 followers, lived in an ashram and trained and disciplined themselves and strategized and went through a 15-year process of self-purification before embarking on the Salt March.
Nonviolent people, that they don't recognize the necessity of fierce discipline and training and strategizing and planning and recruiting and doing the kinds of things that you do to have a movement. That can't happen spontaneously. It has to be done systematically.
Most activists have no training in how to wage peace. Most people have no training in how to wage peace. Most people are not taught basic peace skills. And what if people were as well trained in waging peace as soldiers are in waging war? And bringing the same level of discipline and strategic thinking to the mission of peace that the military brings to war.
It ended up with 12 of us. We got up our courage, did additional nonviolence training, and went down to a People's Drugstore in Arlington, Virginia. Sat down at the lunch counter. It was the most challenging 2 days of my life. People came up and spat at us in the face. People put lit cigarettes down our shirts. People called us every name in the book. We would try to respond in a loving, nonviolent way. which was pretty challenging sometimes. Toward the end of the second day, I was meditating on loving your enemy. And I heard a guy come up from behind me, and he says, if you don't get out of this door in 2 seconds, I'm going to stab this through your heart. And in his hand was a switchblade, which by that time was half an inch or so from my heart. And I had 2 seconds to decide, well, do I really believe in nonviolence, or is there any other way I should relate to this guy? And I just looked him in the eyes and I said, friend, do what you believe is right, but I'll still try to love you. I was 20 years old at the time, and it was kind of miraculous. This face that was contorted with hatred, his jaw began to drop, and his hand that was shaking like this began to fall, and he left the store. Some friendly media people got us out of there alive across the bridge back into Washington, D.C., and we literally shook for 6 days whether we had the courage to go and do it again. And on the 6th day, we got a phone call that the religious and community leaders had met and talked with the business leaders and got a commitment that the drugstores and the eating facilities would be open within 10 days. Seeing it firsthand, seeing the power of nonviolence, and feeling we really have the power to make history, to change history.
Gandhi said, I have not the shadow of a doubt that any human being can do what I've done. In other words, every one of us can play a role.
My name is Micah. And my name is Valerie. We're in 7th grade. The reason why we are here is because we want a future for our generation.
Our evolutionary mandate is to move into the peaceful cooperation, because we see now that we're destroying our own infrastructure. We're destroying the planet we depend on. Some would say, like Stephen Hawking, well, we need to get off the planet and colonize elsewhere. And I say to that, if I were on the Galactic Council, I wouldn't give humans another planet before we clean this act up.
My hope lies in creating something new. Where I would like to go looks very different from the places that we've been. I want to move beyond those systems. I want to actually create something that's aligned with my values. I want to create something that's aligned with life. I want to create something that's aligned with respect and this balanced sense of well-being for all.
In ancient India, the great sage Shankara had this model of the Tapatreya, that there are 3 sources of suffering: from the environment, from other people, and finally, and most importantly, within ourselves. So my teacher, Eknath Ishran, he kind of turned that around and said, okay, we need to establish the 3 harmonies then. Harmony 1 with the outer world, yes. Harmony 2 with other beings. Most important, and actually starting point, is the harmony within ourselves. So to do that first part, we recommend 5 steps. Avoid violent media. We have so many alternatives today.
We need people to get involved in this work, which inspires our communities to understand that there are effective ways of dealing with conflicts.
Take up a spiritual practice. Try to relate personally wherever you can. And from there, that harmonic energy can be radiated out into our relationship with other people, and then finally to the whole world.
We're on the river with a couple hundred kayakers who have staged in front of the Fennica. That's an ice-breaking ship for Shell Oil. It's behind that tarp. Now, these folks here today, very lively, chanting climate justice. Shell, no, we won't go. And they have banners also saying, save the Arctic and other sentiments.
Every time I think it's gonna take much longer, we shall overcome. Every time I question them, I get stronger. We have just begun. Gotta make a change, we gotta push much farther. We shall overcome. We shall overcome.
Avoid commercial media. Learn about nonviolence by reading about its rich history and taking a training. Take up a spiritual practice, such as meditation. Find a personal connection with people around you. Find where your special skills meet the world's urgent needs and find a project to work on.
We're in a time where it is no longer us versus them, but it's all of us or none, and everyone has something to contribute. So identifying what people want to give, be it time, money, ideas, other things, is a way that we can build how wide a nonviolent movement can be.
Nonviolence can be practiced individually in our day-to-day interactions, but don't stop there. There are all these institutions that put nonviolence into the picture. In the country, we have restorative justice in schools and in prisons.
It's a way for someone to take accountability and be brought back into the community so that they can repair the harm that has been done. They're able to sit down with the people that had been harmed and somebody to kind of mediate that conversation, and everybody can come to some sort of middle ground. I use a lot of I statements. I try not to point the finger and say, you're doing this, or you make me feel a certain way. I try and say, I see it as, or I feel that it could go this way. It's really trying not to point the finger and make somebody feel cornered, because that's how conflict starts.
Internationally even, we have civilian peacekeeping. Thanks to the work of Nonviolent Peace Force and some other groups like Meta Peace Teams and Christian Peacemaker Teams, Peace Brigades International, the United Nations is actually starting to take a serious look at unarmed civilian peacekeeping.
Mel Duncan, I represent Nonviolent Peace Force US. We are here today to urge you to include unarmed civilian protection as a recommended activity within the State Foreign Operations and Related Programs budget for 2020, including in the following programs: Women, Peace and Security, Transition Initiatives, the Office of Reconciliation in South Sudan.
The more that we apply nonviolence and the more that we use unarmed civilian protection in areas of violent conflict, the more that we see behavioral change, where decisions made at the interpersonal, at the inter and intra-communal level, local governance levels, and moving on up to larger decision-making, start taking on the characteristics of nonviolence and characteristics of constructive change rather than destructive change.
I request respectfully that we have a hearing in this committee where we bring the Attorney General before us to tell us what we are doing with these camps on the southern border.
We have to think big. Sojourner Truth didn't think small. Martin Luther King didn't. Gandhi didn't. They had big, bold ideas. And I want our young people to not get cynical about having big, bold ideas and to really be willing to fight with love.
We are united. We are called the United States of America for that reason. Together we are whole. Together we are one. Look to your left, look to your right. Brothers and sisters is what I see.
It's actually patriotic to fight for peace and to demilitarize, denuclearize, and to think about national security as economic security, domestic security, peace and justice. I mean, they're not separated concepts.
Governments have spent billions and billions of dollars getting violent science right in the past 400 years. And I think that it's time that we invest some time and energy into alternatives.
We actually don't have 100 years to figure this out. We don't have that luxury of time. We have actually things on our plate in this moment on Earth, like the climate crisis, that is a ticking clock on those of us who would like to see nonviolence make some significant changes in this world. So, what are we waiting for?
And some others are beginning to believe that not only is nonviolence a natural endowment for the human being, it is the defining endowment of the human being.